Hey, Neurofeedback moms. I am Miriam Bellamy. I am the mom who started this group, and I am the director of Whole Family Neurofeedback. As many of you know, one of the benefits of being a neurofeedback mom is that you get access to the first access to some of the world's leading experts on issues that you care about. And we all care about parenting. Mr. Kohn, you might not know, but a lot of the women in the group, there's a lot of dads there too, have kids who carry the diagnosis of ADHD. They're looking for neurofeedback because they need they feel they need some kind of help. And so I don't know that you necessarily really talk about ADHD much, but maybe we'll sort of touch on that. But I want to start today by sort of asking moms who might be listening this question is, do you ever worry that you're spoiling your children? Do you ever worry that you're doing too much for them? Or do you worry that you're doing too little? I know my girls are 20 and 18, and that's definitely been a concern that I've had, just always running. Mm-hmm. Do you have a spouse or a mother-in-law or a grandparent who asks you the question, who's in charge of this house? Who's really in charge here? But where did this idea of spoiling your children come from? Mr. Kohn has written 14 books, and one of them that I'd like to focus in on today is The Myth of the Spoiled Child. And he helps us, or is going to help us, explore this running commentary and where it came from. So thank you, Mr. Kohn, very much for being here today. I really appreciate your time. Sure, my husband and I actually met you many years ago when our girls were probably not even starting or just starting elementary school. And I found very, very helpful at that time. We decidedly became very not grades focused. Now, that doesn't mean that the schools they went to weren't, but at home, we had a very different rhetoric going on. So what made you write The Myth of the Spoiled Child? And can you sort of, for those who haven't read it or are familiar with your work, what's the premise?
I had already written more of a how-to book, more conventionally, about parenting called Unconditional Parenting. Okay. And several years later, well, whenever I find that research and good values and logic point in one direction, but conventional beliefs and practices head off in a different direction, my antennas start quivering. And I think there may be, I get annoyed, and there may be another book in this. So what I have found is that even people who are relatively progressive on political matters, in thinking about any number of issues from race to the environment, to the economy, nevertheless, when the conversation turns to teaching or raising children, they suddenly sound like they're on Fox News. So there is this right-wing narrative that has become the dominant, the default belief about kids. And on the one hand, it holds that we're all spoiling our kids, and therefore, by being too permissive, they have no boundaries and they do whatever they want and they're become terrible people. And on the other hand, at the same time, somehow we're overprotecting them. We're guilty of being helicopter parents or something of the kind, indulging them by doing too much, getting too involved in their lives. And then closely related to those two beliefs is this narrative that kids have things too easy these days, that we give them trophies just for showing up, and they get A's too easily, and we praise them for every little thing and so on. And I wanted to dig down into, to the extent these were descriptive statements, whether there was any empirical evidence to support the idea that, for example, more parents are permissive now than was the case before, or that kids are struggling in certain ways that they didn't used to. And to the extent that this stuff is not based on description, but more prescription, here's what you should do, trying to peel back the layers to see what the values really are here. And I discovered that there is really no good evidence to support the idea of indulgence. The perennial accusation that parents are too permissive with kids goes back decades. In fact, at the beginning of the book, I talk about the golden era before we started being permissive, that was mentioned in contemporary books. And then I go back and find books written then that go back another couple of decades where the same exact charge was being made. And it goes back before the 60s, even before Dr. Spock and so on.
Didn't you quote an article from the 1800s that was really worried about that generation?
That's right. There's some claims that go back even thousands of years about, although it's hard to be sure about the attribution. But the overparenting claim is a series of media-stoked fears. And by the way, I don't argue that that we ought to be permissive, that's a good thing. I challenge, first of all, I think by and large, the real problem that we face, at least in this country, at least now, is not permissiveness so much as a fear of being thought permissive that leads us to overcompensate by over-controlling children. Sometimes with threats and punishments, even though we prefer to call it, consequences, so we can feel better about making kids feel bad, or by sugar-coated control in the form of rewards and praise, as in, good job, I really like the way you, which is just as manipulative and damaging, but just as much about control. The idea that we're sitting back and letting kids raise themselves makes absolutely no sense. But the alternative is to work with kids to solve problems, not to do things to them with coercion, sugar-coated or not, or a laissez-faire, hands-off model where we don't do anything at all. And when you start looking too about the question of parental support, I think you find that the real danger in most families is a lack of good support. I don't think we need to do less for kids so they can be magically self-sufficient on our timetable. The question is, are we providing kids with the support they need? There is a problem when we get involved too much with kids' lives because we need them to need us. So if it's our needs that are driving what's going on, that is a problem. But that's very different from saying that for all kids, they need less help and we need to back off. There's a wide range of what kids need, and we have to be responsive to those needs. One last overall point, then we can go off in whatever direction you want, is to the extent that something like helicopter parenting turns out to be problematic, it's not because of the conservative critique that we're overindulging them or coddling them and making their lives too easy. It's because we're over-controlling them in a different way, in exactly the same sense that many of the same conservatives have been arguing we should do with things like rewards and punishments and demanding obedience. So the problem is a lack of supporting kids' autonomy and ability to make decisions. That's a good thing. The problem is not indulgence or a sort of sweeping critique of helicopter parenting. Kids learn to make good decisions by making decisions, not by following directions. The question is, how do we provide the kind and degree of support they need in order to be autonomous people who feel like they have some impact on their lives?
So I think, an important part of what your point is in the book as well is that this helicoptering thing, let's say, for example, isn't as widespread as this rhetoric would have us believe.
That's right.
That it's much more just isolated, and that the problem that is widespread is much more around the idea of being controlling, whether that's controlling with rewards or whether that's controlling with punishments, right?
Yes, I think that's right.
Okay. And so thinking about going back to when my girls were little, And all of us, by the way, have the ADHD diagnosis, whatever that means to you. Took me a long time to sort of accept that there's something to that. It's time to go to the grocery store and nobody wants to go, or it's time and we have to be on time to go to the doctor, something like that. So if we're not pressing for obedience, we're working to cultivate kind of a different kind of mindset. How do you sort of distinguish that? How do you talk about, it's not about being permissive or nor pushing for obedience? How does a parent sort of think about that?
Well, those aren't 2 points on the same continuum. I mean, permissiveness is one is a goal. The other is a kind of style of parenting, I suppose, that could be in the service of any number of different goals. So where I like to start when I work with parents is to ask, what are your long-term goals for your kids? How would you like them to turn out years from now? Is there a word or a phrase that springs to mind that captures an overriding objective? I would like my kid ultimately to be X. And I've done this activity with parents and with teachers, by the way, hundreds of times all over the world. And I get the same kind of answers wherever I go. I want my kid to be happy, to be ethical, to be caring and compassionate, but also independent and self-reliant, to be curious, creative, a critical thinker, successful, problem solver, that kind of stuff.
You want to know what my answer was?
What's that?
What my answer was at that time? My answer was, I want them to want to come around when they're in their 20s and 30s, and right?
Right. You would like them to want to be with you when they have a choice.
Yeah,
and
right.
What I do for a living is I say to people, you say you want this, so why are you doing that? Because here's the evidence showing that when we do that, we get less of this. So for example, when you reward or use any kind of consequence, any kind of bribe or threat, carrot or stick with kids, they tend to be more selfish, more self-centered, less concerned about the impact of their actions on other people. Because the point now is not to make other people feel better. They've learned the point is when I do what this person with more power has, when I do what they want, I get a reward, even if it's only that patronizing pat on the head, or I avoid a punishment and so on. So when you say, good job, I like the way you shared your toys with Diane, you've just made her a little more self-centered. Because now she's learned the point of sharing is just to get that reaction from you. So you got to pick. Are you really interested in helping a child become generous and empathic? Or are you more interested in getting that, expressing your own desire or offering some kind of positive reinforcement and so on? One of the long-term goals we have is the kind of relationship that they have with us, which speaks to the goal that you came out with. And years before I was writing, there was a guy named Thomas Gordon who came up with an approach called parent effectiveness training, or PET. And he said in that book many years ago, the more we use our power over kids to get them to do what we want, the less influence we will have on their lives. And that's closely related to the kind of relationship we would like them to have. We need to develop a caring mutual relationship with us that isn't just based on getting compliance, which is, by the way, the goal implicitly or explicitly in the vast majority of parenting resources. It's all about whatever you want your kid to do. I assume that's legitimate. Here are some tricks and techniques for getting the kid to jump through your hoops. Whereas in my work, I start by asking, is it possible that when kids don't do what we want, the problem is not with the kid, but with what we want? That doesn't go down so easily with a lot of people. And so before we even get to the question of what degree of involvement in our children's lives makes sense, not just how much do we intervene or how often, but in what way do we do that? And is it really at the behest of the kid or because we unilaterally decide to do that? Before we even get to the style of interaction, we need to ask, is the goal just to get obedience, which is what's assumed? And if we really want kids to be happy, ethical, caring, and so on, then we have to reject the false dichotomy of either controlling kids, albeit in a nicer way maybe, or letting kids become self-sufficient as soon as possible and backing off, and instead choose an approach that I call a working with approach. How do we solve this problem together?
And so, for example, if we're talking about going to the grocery store, I'm a single mom, I'm not, but I'm a single mom, let's say, I'm working, I don't have money for a babysitter. I mean, we need to go to the grocery store, but nobody wants to go.
Nobody wants to go. Well,
how do we do that?
A lot of it depends. There's so many, I mean, one can come up with scenarios, you know, vignettes, hypotheticals, but so much depends on the questions we would ask about this situation. One of the things that makes rewards and punishments so appealing is it takes very little talent or effort or time or care or courage to bribe or threaten a kid into doing whatever we want.
Yeah.
A working with approach requires us to be detectives. It requires us to be open to the possibility, first of all, that our request is not reasonable or developmentally appropriate. And then to figure out, well, what's going on when my kid is going crazy in the grocery store? And finally I go, aha, it's in the late afternoons. Is there a way we can go at a time when she's not starting to, you know, to burn down, you know?
And get hungry for dinner or something.
or be hungry. That's right.
Yes,
the same thing is true with kids who pop out of their room repeatedly at night, you know, after we put them to bed. Is that because they're monsters in the closet? Because she's hungry? Because she didn't get to spend enough time with us? Because she's processing something emotional that happened in school today? Because she's just not tired yet? Each of those answers will point us, obviously, in a very different direction. So a one-size-fits-all approach, like positive reinforcement or consequences, is seductive because it seems so easy, but it's ultimately not going to solve the problem and may make the problem worse because it doesn't get to where the trouble is. I mean, we could go on spitballing why the child is going crazy at the store. Are there going to be, you know, is there going to be argument about what to buy? Is there a way, if you have absolutely no choice, you have to go out and you have to take the kid with you? Is there a way that you don't treat the child like a pet? If you're good for our whole trip, I'll buy you that big box of candy posing as breakfast cereal or whatever, you know, instead of this kind of manipulative stuff, figuring out is there a game we can play? Is there a game we can make up where we ask questions about stuff? Is the child old enough to be able to participate in the shopping decisions where it actually becomes pretty interesting for the child and helpful in helping the child? I mean, I don't know. It depends on your child, on your mood, on you know, how old the child is, on many, many other things.
So many
you
things,
have to figure it out in each instance. You can't just say, here's a recipe for how to make kids stop fussing.
No, but I like your idea of sort of becoming a detective. I think that's a useful construct, right? And how do you get to those answers? And I think we have to be, depending on the child and depending on maybe you as a parent too, get kind of creative about it, you know, and really be thinking. We just have a few more minutes. I wanted to talk, and I wonder if you could help me understand a little bit more too. At the towards the end of the myth of the spoiled child, you started talking about the marshmallow research.
Oh yeah.
which I, by the way, have misquoted, and I'm very glad to know what the actual implications were of that research. But I wonder if you could summarize the research, how it's been misinterpreted, and then what do we take from that? What are these cognitive constructs?
So big picture is, at the end of the book, The Myth of the Spoiled Child, I talk about how the same people complaining ceaselessly about how kids are treated too easily and they don't have what they need, and their self-esteem is too high, and they're indulged and so on, that there's a very right wing, so to speak, in a social conservative sense, prescription, which is that what kids need is not self-esteem to feel good about themselves for everything, but instead to develop self-discipline, self-regulation, Deferral of Gratification, which is all based on a model of how to make them obey authority, regardless of the reasonableness of authority. So
that's where I'm super fascinated, is that there's some kind of an inverse relationship, I think you were saying, between self-discipline and not happiness, but can you fill in that blank for me? That it's so overrated, I think.
I kind of talk about different kinds of self-discipline or internalization of stuff. It's not always a good thing. Sometimes it represents a kind of swallowing whole or introjection of a coercive mentality where kids are feel controlled by remote control. So nobody has to stand in front of them with a carrot or behind them with a stick anymore. They're doing their homework.
We've taken it in. I'm one of those.
Right. But that represents a kind of a sense of being unfree, a sense where the external authority has succeeded too well at undermining the child's sense of autonomy by implanting this device where the kid is now feeling a kind of compulsive need to obey authority, do what she's told, or do well at school or something, which does not promote, intellectual depth. It certainly doesn't promote mental health and so on. So connected to the idea of self-discipline is the idea of deferral of gratification. So along comes a researcher named Walter Mischel some years ago, who did this experiment, which has been falsely described in most press reports as being, if you hold out for 2 marshmallows rather than taking the one offered you now and are able to show that degree of control over yourself, self-discipline, you'll have a better, more productive life. But
better SAT scores too.
Yeah, that was the claim.
Right, all of that.
That's right. So that's actually what interested Mischel wasn't whether kids could wait for a bigger treat, which, by the way, almost all of them could. It wasn't even whether the waiters fared better in life than the non-waiters. What he was interested in was how kids go about trying to wait when that's hard and which strategies help. And it turned out that the kids waited longer when they were distracted by a toy. What worked best wasn't self-denial and grim determination, but doing something fun so that you didn't need self-control. So that's completely different from the way conservatives have represented the studies, even to the extent that he looked at characteristics of the individual kids, because he was mostly interested, Mischel was mostly interested in how do you set up the environment to foster certain things, not which internal characteristics predict to it. The whole field of social psychology says we make this fundamental error of attribution, like blaming or crediting things about inside us, when most of how we act is a function of how we respond to the system we're in. For example, to take one example from the classroom, what predicts to kids cheating in school or not cheating is not how good their character is, but what kind of classroom it is. If they use grades where kids are set against each other in contests, and there's strong pressure to do well in school from parents or teachers, kids are much more likely to cheat. But in a more progressive school where the focus is on the learning itself as intrinsically valuable, and they don't use grades or rewards or punishments, virtually no one cheats. That's a parallel example of how it's about the structure that people are in, not about what's inside them, like self-discipline, for example. And by the way, there was a study done a few years ago, sort of piggybacking on Michel's point, that found that when kids had an experience where they were told to wait, something good will happen, and that didn't turn out to be the case in their lives, those kids took the one marshmallow. And the researchers said, as well they ought, So the question is, what is your experience before? Sometimes you take what you can while you can. So if they had learned in life that you grab things while you're able to, their tendency to do that did not reflect a problematic lack of ability to defer gratification or lack of self-regulation. It predicted kids who were pretty observant and rational in their response.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm sort of thinking about myself. I'm a rather impulsive person, and it has almost always served me very well.
And by the way,
I can make quick decisions. Go ahead.
But it serves you well in some situations and maybe less well in other situations. So once again, whether it makes sense to defer, it depends on the situation you're in.
Right.
And by the way, and this may be a little unsettling perhaps for you or some of your listeners, but the emphasis that we see from so much in social psychology on how critical the environment is also plays a role in thinking about the whole concept of ADHD. There's research indicating that this is not a brain disorder within children or adults to be fixed. It is the way that some kids respond to certain environments. So that, for example, early studies in the 70s found that when kids were in more progressive classrooms where they had more say about what they were learning, observers were unable to pick out the supposedly ADHD kids because they didn't act that way. When the kids were doing something that was meaningful for them, rather than hunched over worksheets that nobody in his or her right mind would want to do, they did not show that attentional deficit. They didn't run around that much. So it was a function of the relationship between the individual and the environment. Note how challenging that is to the only two mainstream ways of dealing with people who are instantly diagnosed as having this thing called ADHD, which is either you drug them to shut up and sit still, or you treat them like a pet using some form of behavior management to change them, not to change the requests made of them, the demands made of them, the situations in which they're put. So very much like the whole push for self-discipline, for growth mindset, for grit, all of these are profoundly conservative ideas to the extent they distract us from asking the systemic questions about the families and schools in which kids find themselves and lead us to focus on merely changing the attitude, orientation, skills, etc. of the kid who's the problem. Who benefits from that reframing?
Yeah, there's a list. No, you're not stepping on my toes at all. Actually, I had a great deal of difficulty with the diagnosis, and still it's a little bit of an interesting, what's the whole picture there, you know? So I definitely resisted it for both the girls when they got them, and I certainly resisted it for myself for a long time. But it's interesting the way you said, the way some kids respond in certain environments. And this idea of the system, are you familiar, this is with Bowen family systems theory? Have you come across that ever in your...
I've come across the name, but I don't know enough to, I'm not informed enough to have an opinion.
Okay. It's a theory that acknowledges, you know, the genetic, that kind of thing, but really looks at every emotional issue that we might have in a context.
Right. And there are many, for example, most social workers are trained in a kind of family systems approach. Fewer psychologists and psychiatrists are. So they talk about the identified patient, implying that this may not be the only problem here is this person. And I see this when I work with teachers with classroom management issues as well. I've got this bad kid. I want to be able to send the kid out on a timeout or send this kid home, suspend him, expel him. This kid's terrible. And if you think about it, when you do that, first of all, by saying in effect, by modeling for everybody else, you are in here only conditionally, as long as I approve, that makes everyone feel unsafe, including all the kids in whose name you're allegedly, you know, exiling that kid. But often it's like when you get rid of the bad kid, another one pops up to play that role, like the next Kleenex in the box. Systems theory again.
That is an image. I love it. Yeah. Yeah, anyway, it's a whole study of how system, the family emotional system specifically is a piece of that puzzle, and maybe the most important piece, but that idea of context. So I realize that we're out of time. If somebody wants to reach you, go to your website. Do you have a newsletter? Tell us how to.
Website is the best way. It's my name, alfiekohn.org. It has hundreds of articles available for free, as well as information about my books and other stuff as well. I tweet in a limited way, often with links to research for parents and teachers, but that's only a few characters. There are a lot more characters in my books and articles.
So actually, and I'll point people to your blog. You wrote one recently, I can't remember the title, but something about you can't see the whole person from their brain scan kind of thing.
Oh, that was a couple of years ago. Yeah. All the blog posts are also on the website too.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. I thought that was great. And it really fits with sort of my approach to neurofeedback. It's whole family neurofeedback because I want mom and dad hooked up too. And I really try to discourage this idea that you're fixing the brain.
Right.
You're mirroring back to the brain with our neurofeedback, its own activity, and the brain takes it from there. Anyway, thank you, sir. Really appreciate you today. All right.
My pleasure. Thanks.